Hello, and thank you for joining us today for this webcast, The New Normal for Clinical Trials and Planning for the Future. My name is Ashley Swalje, Clinical Go-to-Market Manager, and I will be your host today. Before we jump in, let's go over some housekeeping items. First, if at any time you're having technical difficulties, click on the Test Your Connection button, and this will take you to a connection checker as well as an FAQ page. If you are still experiencing any issues, there's a Chat Now function in order to go through to the support team who can help you. Do you want to enlarge your presentation? Just click the Maximize icon on the lower left corner of the presentation window to enlarge. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so if you have questions, we want to hear from you. To ask something to our presenters, type your question into the question window toward the bottom of the screen, and then hit Submit. We'll be answering as many questions as possible during the Q&A session, and if there's any extras that we can't get to, we will answer them for you after the webcast through email. And since we know that you'll want to listen to this webinar again and also share it with colleagues, today's session is being recorded, and it will be available for you to view on demand following the end of the live event. So I'd now like to introduce our speakers. First, the moderators for our discussion are Dr. Ted Search and Lonnie Brannon. Ted is a pharmacist, an innovation advocate, entrepreneur, tech guru, and expert in healthcare. He's been invited to speak at various healthcare and technology conferences around the world and named among the top 10 100 most inspiring people in the life sciences industry in 2015 and among the top 100 elite entrepreneurs in the pharmaceutical and healthcare industry in 2016. Lonnie Brannon is the Senior Director of Citeline Sitetrove, the pharma industry's most comprehensive clinical investigator and trial site intelligence solution, and Citeline Engage, which combines this solution with the leading online community of verified healthcare professionals powered by Skipta. Today, Ted and Lonnie are joined by Dr. Valerie McLaughlin and Dr. Marwan Faqih. Dr. McLaughlin is the Professor of Cardiovascular Medicine and Director of the Pulmonary Hypertension Program at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. She is a principal investigator of several major clinical trials of drug therapies for pulmonary arterial hypertension and has published numerous papers in this field. Dr. McLaughlin is currently the principal investigator for 5 clinical trials and is on the steering committee for trials that are currently in process or planning stages, as well as a DSMB member. Dr. Marwan Faqih is a professor of medical oncology and therapeutics research, has a Judy and Bernard Briskin Distinguished Directorship in Clinical Research, is the Associate Director for Clinical Services, the Medical Director for Briskin Center for Clinical Research, the Co-Director for the GI Cancer Program, and the Section Head for GI Medical Oncology. Over the last 18 years, Dr. Faqih's career has focused on colorectal cancer research and clinical drug development for phase 1 and 2 trials. He's conducted numerous investigator-initiated trials in patients with solid tumors and colorectal cancer. So welcome to all of our speakers. Thank you very much for joining us today. And with that, I will hand things over. Ted, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ashley, and welcome to our audience and to our distinguished guests, both Dr. McLaughlin and Dr. Faqih. First off, a special thank you to you both and also to all of our physicians and healthcare providers in attendance today, really for your commitment and service to both medicine and to the patients in your care. As Ashley mentioned, I am Dr. Theodore Search, and I'm joined by my colleague, Lonnie Brannon. Lonnie and I have the pleasure and honor to serve as the moderators for our discussion today. In our discussion, we will cover 4 topics related to the new normal for clinical trials and planning for the future. Dr. McLaughlin and Dr. Faqih, we look forward to your input on all of our questions, and thank you for your valuable time. To our attendees, as Ashley mentioned, please feel free to submit questions in the window at that bottom of the screen. We will address them throughout the presentation and also at the end. And with that, we will get started. And our first topic is clinical trial normalization timelines. Dr. McLaughlin, if I could, or Dr. Fakih, if I could start with you first on this question. According to our survey of 100 clinical trial investigators, 87% believe that clinical trial operations would normalize by early 2021. 30% expected operations to actually be normal by today. Do these expectations meet your reality? What is your experience? I'll pass it on to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted. So first, it's a pleasure to be here with you today and to be part of this program. So I somewhat agree with those numbers. I think there's still a lot of unknowns, though, as to how COVID is going to play out in the wintertime and if that's going to result in some unexpected bumps across the road in enrollment. But when COVID hit, and California was one of those states that had been affected, we really kind of slowed down in activating clinical trials, specifically phase 1 first in human studies. We really focused on slowing down studies where there's no clear or high likelihood of clinical benefit in patients. And we slowed down some of the non-therapeutic trials to focus on the therapeutic studies. And in that course, we've seen about a 20% decline in enrollment on clinical trials over the months of March, April, and June. But surprisingly, and as we adjusted to the new reality and as we've taken additional measures, we have seen a rebound in the enrollment. And actually, what I can tell you at City of Hope today, it looks like in 2020, our enrollment on clinical trial will exceed 2019. And talking to many of my colleagues and looking at the experience in California, we've seen, that many institutes have initially shut down the doors on clinical trials and on activation because of the expectations that, they're going to be facing a strain on inpatient resources, but this has not occurred in many of those centers, and many of those centers now have ramped up. I think we're going to see a lot of heterogeneity across the country, and it's going to be dependent on institute by institute. But I would see that the majority of the institutes will be able to ramp up.
Thank you, Dr. Fakih. Dr. McLaughlin, same question to you. According to our survey of 100 clinical trial investigators, 87% believe that clinical trial operations would normalize by early 2021. 30% expected operations to actually be normal by today. Do these expectations meet your reality? What has your experience been? And welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Ted, and sorry about that internet glitch. I think that at least at the University of Michigan, we are almost back to normal. We obviously shut down almost everything for a period of time, and then we've gradually ramped it back up, prioritizing certain studies and really also prioritizing for patient safety. Like, for example, the last studies to get up and going included those in immunosuppressed patients. So I think right now we are actually back to our normal phase in terms of bringing patients in terms of how our IRB is operating, in terms of everything. Although I would not be fair if I didn't say we certainly are worried about a second surge. We're worried about having to ramp down a little bit over the coming months, just given the recent numbers.
Great. Thanks, Dr. McLaughlin. We'll stay with you actually for the next question, just based on your response there. And even if you can comment as you're ramping up potentially for a next wave, how are your internal operations going? For example, and specifically, the industry, was very interested to hear if ethics committee reviews were being delayed. Anything you can comment on that, just internal operations in general? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's all going really well. I mean, obviously, we're all getting used to these types of formats, to Zoom, what have you. There's obviously the opportunity to do that sort of review at home and to have virtual meetings. And so our IRB is meeting as regularly as it had. All of our grants and contracts people are working the way that they had. So I'm not seeing any delays in anything like that.
Great. Thanks, Dr. McLaughlin. Dr. Fakih, same question. How are your internal operations going? Interested, again, in hearing anything in regards to ethic committee reviews being potentially delayed. Thank you.
Yeah, as far as IRB, I have to say we've never experienced any delay, and we never really shut off the endorsement processes, even for new studies at City of Hope. I think we basically worked with the disease teams and asking them to prioritize and their studies and to really bring forward initially only the studies where they feel that there is a significant patient need for. And you know, everybody really stepped up to the plate, but even in the darkest days, I think we were endorsing about 70% of the normal. But all the IRB meetings went on time. The SMC meetings went on time. Scientific Review Committee meetings went on time. The central IRB was also functioning as well for some of the pharmaceutical sponsored clinical trials. So we haven't really seen any issues from that operational aspect. I think where we had some more limitations were more from the perspective of the operational body for the clinical trial support, as far as clinical research coordinator and clinical research nurses, where typically you'd have those on site, and obviously with the move towards limiting the number of employees on campus, many of those were asked to work from home. So we've had to kind of rework our strategies around clinical trials.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Fakih. And Lonnie, welcome. I will pass to you for our second topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted, and thank you, Dr. Fakih and Dr. McLaughlin. Great to speak with you today. So our next topic is clinical trial challenges and opportunities. Starting with you, Dr. Fakih, in your perspective, what has been the most challenging when it comes to clinical trials today?
I think we're addressing clinical trials a little bit differently now, and I think there's more strain on patients as well as on the clinical research body. So some of the challenges, for example, from a patient perspective, is you have no visitors with you, right? And any cancer patient is highly dependent on a spouse, a loved one, a friend, to bring them in, be a second set of ears, and navigate them through the process. And I think that's been a challenge. Patients sometimes have to be receiving an experimental drug and have to be observed for 12 hours, and yet there's no one next to them. So I think one of the challenges we're seeing in cancer in general, including clinical trials, is the mental strain that COVID has resulted in. And this also applies to some of the first-in-human studies that require hospitalizations or bispecific antibodies and cellular therapeutics, and now you're in the hospital for 3 days and still you can't see anyone that you know from your family. And so that's one issue. The other challenge that we're facing is some of the operational aspects have been also strained. Typically you'll have your clinical research coordinators on site. Now they're working remotely. Now, yes, you can reach out to them, but it's different. It's not really exactly the same. You're going to have to page them, chat or email, but that's different than having someone being able to come to your clinic, go over the protocol with you. And we've seen some decrease in the number of clinical research nurses that are on site as well. So instead of having, for example, in GI oncology, we have 4 clinical research nurses, and instead of having all 4 of them on site being in the clinics with us, we only have 2 now, and 2 working from home, 2 working from the hospital. Luckily, that kind of system has not impacted the integrity of the studies. But those are some of the operational aspects. Additional operational aspects include meeting with the sponsor. So now, whether you have a new study and you have an activation of the study, instead of having a face-to-face meeting where you go to an investigator meeting and you'll have more engagement, more discussions. Now you have a virtual meeting, or you have to go over a video to go over the study synopsis and etc. So I think those have been the challenges. I think there are challenges from the anxiety of some of the physicians initially that we have seen, even with some of the studies requiring patient visits every week, and the patient is on site. We've had some physicians that preferred not to see the patient and to have a virtual visit with the patient, even though the patient is on campus, because there's this anxiety about COVID. So I think there's a lot of anxiety around. I think things are better now. We're feeling better around it. We've heard from sponsors that they are concerned about not being able to do their monitoring on site. All monitoring now is virtual. But in general, I think we've been able to navigate these surrounds. But I think those are the challenges. Travel for patients. We're seeing a little bit less patients coming from 3 hours, 4 hours drive to go on clinical trials. People have to think twice, for example, for going on a study from San Francisco all the way down to LA, where we've had some patients who used to even fly in, every other week for clinical trials. Now you'll get these virtual consults, and they'll think twice about, coming that far and subjecting themselves to travel through the airport. So I think those are some of the things that we've experienced.
Okay, great. And just a quick follow-on before I turn things, the same question over to Dr. McLaughlin. With regards to the first challenge you mentioned about the support system for the patient, are you finding that that's impacting participation or continued participation, or is it something that they're working through treatment, especially in oncology, where many times, they don't have a lot of options?
I think it probably does impact some. Now, being a comprehensive cancer center and being an investigator that deals predominantly with refractory disease, I don't think we're seeing that impact, because if you reach a stage as a cancer patient where you've exhausted all your options, you're going to, take that extra step. You're going to go that extra mile, and you're going to do everything you can to get another shot at it. But I think where it may make a difference, for example, is that if you're going on a first line metastatic disease therapy, where you have excellent standard of care options, and now you're being asked to go on a randomized clinical trial where the benefit from the experimental agent is less known, and you have a very good standard of care option, which would be your control arm on that study. You're going to probably think twice about that hardship. And so I have no doubt that certain studies would suffer. The type of clinical trial portfolio that I oversee, and given the fact that we deal with more advanced, more refractory disease at City of Hope, and more challenging cases where there's less options as standard of care, we haven't seen that impact us, but I have no doubt that it has impacted other studies.
Okay, thank you. Dr. McLaughlin, so the same question to you. In your perspective, what has been the most challenging when it comes to clinical trials today?
Yeah, so a lot was just covered there. I'll chime in a little bit. I think at least at this point in time, we have less issues with respect to the visitor policies and the like. We now allow every patient to bring one person with them for support during clinic visits and during the hospitalizations as well. So I think we're beyond that currently. While we are also encouraging those who can to work from home, we still have our coordinators on site when needed. So, for example, while they're primarily working from home, when there are study visits, the coordinators come in and do the study visits and are there to shepherd the patients through sometimes very complex study visits. So I think we're beyond those two challenges. I do echo the concerns about just the community, the investigator meetings, the feeling connected with the trials. In fact, immediately prior to this call, I was presenting at an investigator meeting for which I'm on the steering committee. And, despite there being 50 investigators on the call, when we got to the Q&A period, there was almost nothing. It seems like it's really hard to get people engaged at this point in time. I do echo the concerns about patients' willingness to come in as frequently as is needed for some of our studies. Right now, when we see patients, most of them are very happy to come in and see us face to face. We went through that period in March, April, early May when everything was virtual or video or phone, and people actually like coming in and seeing us and getting tests and being examined, and they're happy to do that, for routine care. I think for the frequency that needs to occur for some of our trials, I think patients are still anxious about coming into the hospital or coming into the clinic, despite everything that all of the clinics and hospitals are doing to ensure safety, the screening, the temperature taking, the social distancing, the removing chairs from the waiting room, and the like. So I do think there's some patient anxiety with respect to that. I think one of the challenges is just making sure that we maintain all those safeguards as we go into what may be another surge, the concurrent cold and flu season. I think another challenge is just all the delayed or deferred care that there was. For example, sometimes it's hard for us to schedule certain tests because we are still catching up on all of the, for example, echoes that got canceled in March and April. So I think there's some scheduling, some logistic challenges that are going on as well. But I think there's a number of opportunities, including everything that we can do virtually, and including sponsors really being interested in how they can modify protocols to be more friendly to patients at this point in time.
Of course, yes. Thank you so much. Sticking with you, Dr. McLaughlin, what do you think has gone well? And is there anything specifically that has actually surprised you?
Yeah, I think what we have learned about virtual care has gone well, what we can accomplish that way. I think this has really made all of the sponsors take a critical look at their trials and say, what is really needed, and what was that fluff? How can we streamline things? I'm on a number of steering committees right now and a DSMB that is, they're sorting out how to modify upcoming trials to be more patient friendly, to reduce the visits, to do what they can virtually. And I think in the long run, that is actually going to be good for patients. As challenging as it is now, I think that if we to rapidly.
I think you're back, Dr. McLaughlin. You can continue if you can hear us.
Oh yeah, I can hear. That was my last comment on that.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Dr. Fakih, the same question to you. What do you think has gone well?
I mean, I have to say I've been surprised that despite all the issues around COVID, and despite the social distancing, the implementation of temperature screening, the COVID testing before admission, the COVID testing prior to each procedure that now every single patient has to go through. What has gone well is that we've still been able to enroll, and we've still been able to maintain the conduct of these clinical trials without any major violations. And I think what's gone well is that the sponsors have, at least the majority of the sponsors, had some flexibility in allowing us to do some virtual visits, at least in some patients. So I think I found that patients adapted and they, kept with their treatments and with their visits. I think they understood that it's an interventional study and it's in their best interest to receive the drug. So they really kind of worked with the team in making things happen. So, I was surprised that we were still able to enroll at 80% and more so that we were able to maintain the integrity of these studies. So I do echo that this was a team effort with sponsors, but not all the sponsors allowed for virtual visits, and but some definitely were understanding. Many sponsors put their studies on hold as well. So it's a situation where some of the sponsors said don't enroll anymore, and I think in some instances it was the right decision, and in some instances not necessarily the right decision.
Yeah. It's great to hear there was that flexibility for some, and also that you hit your enrollment numbers too. That's great. Staying in the same section, the last question, Dr. Fakih, I'll start with you. If you were to suggest to clinical trial sponsors that they should consider X as they plan for the future, what would that X be?
I think there were many lessons we've learned from this, is that even within the same state, even within the same city, there are different structures for different hospitals and different healthcare systems. I can tell you that what we have seen is one of the reasons that City of Hope, for example, wasn't impacted as much as others, is that we're a standalone comprehensive cancer center, which means that you don't have an ER open for all patients. We only take care of our own cancer patients. We have a 24-hour urgent care, but you can't be a non-City of Hope patient who just has, respiratory failure and call EMS, and then you would be brought to our ER. You're going to have to go to a university hospital. You're going to have to go to a community hospital. So some of the centers are less likely to be impacted as far as their inpatient services go as much as university hospitals or community hospitals, and those are going to be the comprehensive cancer centers who focus only on cancer care. It doesn't mean they won't be impacted. Our cancer patients can get COVID. So the first message to sponsors is that you have to decide, you have to look at each institute in a different way as far as to what they can deliver and how much the impact of COVID will be. Second is that this is a situation or a scenario where you don't know what to expect, and you have to be able to adapt every single minute here. And it's today COVID is relatively better than before, but what if you do get a surge? And so you can plan for the current situation, but you have to continue to adapt. Third, I think they need to be more willing to look at their protocols and allow for some virtual visitations. I still believe that a face-to-face interaction in the setting of at least in cancer, where you're doing a therapeutic measure, is needed. I mean, there's nothing that replaces a good physical examination, especially in some of the drugs that are not really approved yet, and you need to assess them and by physical examination, whether it's a neuro exam, whether it's a good assessment for mucositis, etc. But frankly, a lot of these protocols require weekly visits, and sometimes it's a lab visit, and there's no reason to bring the patient or to see the doctor for some of those visits, and so be selective and really don't go overboard. We tend to go overboard with our clinical trials. Sometimes the FDA mandates it, sometimes it doesn't. And so do you really need those tests? In this era, do we need to do biopsies 3 times on a tumor? We understand that there's a need to understand the mechanisms of activity, but do you really need it on every single patient, or should you just do it on the expansion cohort, for example, in those patients? And can you allow your physicians or PIs to partner with local providers in certain instances? If it's a phase 3 trial, if it's a phase 2 trial, and that the AEs are acceptable and can be managed by interacting with a primary care physician who is closer to a patient who lives 2 hours or who has to fly in to get on to receive an experimental drug? Can they receive their experimental drug once a month, but yet see a local oncologist who gets to interact with the principal investigator in the center? So I think there's a lot of things that can be that can work on making it easier for patients in this environment. So those would be some of the messages that I would have.
Thank you so much. And Dr. McLaughlin, the same question to you. If you were to suggest to clinical trial sponsors that they should consider X, what would that X be for you?
Yeah, I think he highlighted a whole lot of important issues, and I'll just be very brief and emphasize a few. One is, yes, this is a very dynamic situation. Every time you turn around, something changes, and so flexibility is going to be very important, and also this affects different institutions differently, and so there is going to be some individualization necessary. I mentioned earlier, and he just emphasized lean protocols. Like, you really need to look at the protocol and say, do we really need all of these different visits? Do we need this at every point in time? And really try to figure out how you can minimize the unnecessary encounters, basically. Like, of course, you have to do everything to determine efficacy and safety and, maintain the trial integrity. But is there something else there that really doesn't need to be there yet, maintain efficacy and safety? I think the virtual care is going to be important. I think that we may dig into that more later, but there are going to need to be regulatory issues and safety issues that go hand in hand with trying to incorporate virtual care into these clinical trials, and yet maintain the integrity. So very, very similar top line recommendations.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you so much. Ted, I will turn it over to you for the
Great,
next
thank
section.
you, Lonnie. And just a couple questions that came in that we'll address before we go to our next topic. Dr. McLaughlin, question for you. What is the typical procedure with patient recruitment enrollment and the associated cost per patient enrolled? How have these changed as a result of COVID-19? Anything you're able to comment on that? Thank you.
I think that's really important. So I think at least for us, the recruitment strategy is very similar. I'm also in a rare disease state, and most of the patients that come into our clinical trials are identified in our clinics. Our research coordinators screen our clinics, and we approach patients about clinical trials in our clinics. But obviously, there are many other ways. We have a number of acute COVID trials going on that patients get screened in the ED or in the ICU, and there's many other opportunities for screening patients. I don't think that's really changing. Certainly, the informed consent process has to be very detailed, and sometimes that is happening at least initially remotely. We certainly have a way of doing informed consent now via telemedicine, so I think that is going to be just fine. And Ted, I'm sorry, there was a second part to your question as well. Oh, the cost.
Yeah, and any changes, costs and changes with COVID, correct?
Yeah. Yes, I think the main change is just all the COVID testing that needs to happen before every procedure, and so we are routinely working that into our budgets now. But I think at this point it is important. It's our process to have a COVID test before any interventional procedure, before any hospitalization. So those are now coming into the budgets as well.
Thank you, Dr. McLaughlin. Dr. Fakih, another question that came up specifically for you, sir. You had mentioned, the word violations, some changes. The specific question, what happens for investigators when there is an amendment from their sponsor? What is the impact, on the ground level for you and your team?
Amendments come quite often. So I'm not sure I get the question if it's specific to COVID, but if for example, you typically in this COVID era, we were getting memos, and the memos were, either advising us as to how to address as far as COVID testing. Does the protocol require COVID testing? What to do in the setting of a patient not being able to come for a visitation that is related to the protocol. But as far as the routine processing of an amendment, it has not changed. If there's an amendment on the protocol, it goes through the regulatory body. If it requires an IRB review, it will get reviewed by the IRB. If it's expedited, it's expedited. If there is a major change on the protocol, some of these may even have to go through the scientific review committee. But we've experienced initially some delays in the amendment activation because of the initial strain on the regulatory body, but things went back to normal quite quickly.
Great. Thank you very much for that. That's excellent. So we're going to just proceed on to our third topic. We do have a number of questions coming in, so thank you to everyone for asking questions. We'll be sure to get to them just momentarily. Our third topic is on clinical trial design and enrollment. Now, we touched a little bit on this in some of the responses earlier, so I'm going to make this kind of a twofold question, if you both don't mind. And Dr. McLaughlin, I'll start with you. So first off, what have your recent patient enrollment experiences been like? I know that was talked about a little earlier. And the second part of that question, with everything going on in the world, have you seen any increase in clinical trial diversity? Do you think the industry will be successful in making clinical trials more diverse? And if so, how? Dr. McLaughlin?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So in terms of our clinical trials, I think we're back to normal now. We enroll patients. We have actually a lot of exciting phase 2s going on right now. And so at least in my world, the phase 2s tend to be a little bit smaller numbers, but I think that's all going well. I think patients are interested in some ways. I'm in a similar situation that oftentimes patients don't have a lot of other options, and they're very excited about some of these phase 2 trials. So I think that is, baseline right now. I think the diversity issue is a really good one, and I unfortunately don't have a solution to that. I think it has to do a lot with with where you are, what the hospital or the clinic's patient population demographics are like, what the diseases demographics are like, what the willingness of and trust of individuals are in their investigators. I wish I had an answer. That one's not going to be easy.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dr. McLaughlin. Dr. Fakih, same questions to you. I know, again, you had responded to the first one a little bit earlier, but just a summary of what your recent patient enrollment experiences have been like. And then again, with everything going on in the world, have you seen any increases in clinical trial diversity? Do you think the industry will be successful in making clinical trials more diverse? If so, how? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think what we have seen with COVID is somewhat, at least on a personal level, I've seen a change in the mix of the population. Now, to start with, we've been always focused on refractory disease because, I do colon cancer, and the bread and butter for is first line, second line in the community, and those are easy. But I can tell you, we've started seeing less and less patients coming for a second opinion, and therefore, after a recent diagnosis of metastatic disease, we've seen less and less patients coming through their first line treatment, and which tells me that with COVID, people would go to a comprehensive cancer center that is far away from where they live, only if they have to now. In other words, before you get hit with a diagnosis of cancer and your provider in the local community says, well, this is what we can do, it's quite effective, you're satisfied with that, and you'll say, okay, I'm not going to seek clinical trials now because there's a good treatment with all what's going on. I'm not going to go to another center for second opinion. So I think that will impact and has impacted enrollment on first line and second line studies. And on the flip side, as I said before, if you have no options, as a patient, you have no options, and you have to seek, options that are not available in the community. And those patients are still coming, and maybe even more now than before. And so since we focus on those studies, our enrollment is still robust. We're enrolling 120 patients in GI cancer on therapeutic trials this year. Last year, I think we were about 90, 95. So we're going up rather than down. as far as diversity, so I'm not sure if I get the question right. There's a diversity of the clinical trial, meaning the type of clinical trial being diverse, and there is the diversity of patients enrolling on the clinical trial. And I think the question is, and answer would be different for both. As far as patient diversity, I think that has been a challenge, and I think it's more of a challenge now because, if you have limited socioeconomic situation where you're dependent on others, and now with the economy not being as good, especially for the blue collar community, it's harder to come here. If the kids are at home and you're dependent on your daughter to bring you to for a consultation, and now she's got to have to homeschool, that's also more difficult. So people aren't really having the same support that they had before, which affects people driving in the distance. So even if you don't have the money to fly in, you drive in for 3 hours when you have cancer. So that's common. So we're seeing that issue. Those who have the resources are going to come. But I think, unfortunately, those with limited resources have been affected, and probably are affected more now through COVID than before. How do you go around it as a sponsor? I think you're going to have to go to the patient, or you're going to have to start looking at some programs where you bring the studies to those patients. How can you partner with some of the local oncologists? How can you, involve certain televisits where, yes, you open the study in a local hospital, but still there is a PI that is in a comprehensive cancer center where there's no extra cost to the local patient. There is, support budgeting for the comprehensive cancer center to oversee the study remotely, but have a local oncologist on site. So unless you do that, I'm afraid that there's not going to be a significant, bump in those numbers, or identify a local practice that is fit to do those studies in that particular underserved community.
Thanks, Dr. Fakih. Just before I pass to Lonnie, we had a few more questions coming in from the audience. Dr. McLaughlin, if I could ask this question to you. What were the most important strategies implemented to ensure financial sustainability of your research program?
So the institutions have been hit very hard by financial constraints during this time. I think I'm very fortunate in terms of my program that we still had patients in trials. We still had patients in registries actually as well that we could continue. And so we actually had a lot of startup activities for phase 2 trials. And so we had the coordinators working on that and the startup funds coming from that. So they kept busy, and via different mechanisms, we still had money coming in. So we were able to weather that storm with the activity that we had going on.
Great. Thanks, Dr. McLaughlin. Lonnie, I'll pass to you for our fourth and final topic. Thank you.
Sure. Great. Thank you. So talking a little bit more about technology in clinical trials, and especially now when there's been a lot more telehealth and visits, as we discussed. Dr. McLaughlin, starting with you, we had earlier on talked about this survey of 100 clinical investigators that we had launched. And when they were asked, how do you expect clinical trials to change after the COVID-19 pandemic, 69% said more virtual or hybrid trials, 35% stated leaner protocols, and 24% stated a focus on patient burden. These are all elements that we have been discussing. What are your thoughts on those percentages? And is there one area that you think we may see changing faster or more so than since then?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's an important question. A lot of those things are intermixed. I think it would be very difficult to do an interventional clinical trial entirely virtual. I think it's going to end up being some sort of hybrid, but I think there are going to be a lot of details that need to be taken into consideration. And I do have some experience with this. And, even before COVID, we were trying to figure out how some things in a particularly onerous trial could be done at home. And I think there are regulatory issues and responsibility issues that are going to need to be worked out. You know, there's only so much an investigator can do with a virtual visit. You know, you can talk to the patient, you can assess symptoms. You obviously can't examine them. You don't have any test results. You're not dispensing investigational drugs. So, you know, when that's all that's required in the visit, that's great. I think the migration to trying to do more virtually is going to require lots of pieces coming together. You know, there's a study that I'm on the DSMB for. They want to get started again. It's an IV infusion that used to be done in an infusion center, and now it's going to be done in the home. So they're going to have a specialty nurse go into the home and put in a certain type of catheter so that the infusion can happen, you know, X number of hours every day for 5 days. The nurse is going to stay there and monitor the vital signs. It's great. It's very patient friendly. It's wonderful that the patients don't need to come into the clinic for that or into the infusion center, but that it raises a lot of questions, right? Who's responsible for all of that? You know, you're going to take the investigational drug pharmacy out of the loop. The investigator can't possibly be responsible for an employee of an agency. So regulatory wise, you know, how does that work? It's going to need to be a different setup with the sponsor essentially taking responsibility for that portion of the protocol. And different institutions are going to have different legal views on that. And it may not be the same for every institution. So I think there are some things that are going to be able to be done virtually, but if it's a study-related procedure, I think there are going to be assurances that need to be put in place. And of course, maintaining quality is important. I think both of us as investigators take a lot of pride in the quality and sticking to the protocol and minimizing violations or deviations or what have you. And, you know, I know I'm that way as an investigator, and thinking about someone else doing an important part of a study in the home, you know, kind of makes me a little uncomfortable. But I think that we're going to try to march to a way of getting some of that stuff done safely and consistent with the protocol as outpatients as we move into this winter season.
Thank you. Dr. Fiki, same question to you. Do you think those percentages make sense, or do you think there's one change we'll see maybe happening quicker?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with the comments from Dr. McLaughlin. You know, I think to think that everything's going to go virtual is just not going to happen. For the therapeutic trials, I think a hybrid model could be implemented, but I cannot see somebody getting chemotherapy or novel immunotherapy or bispecific antibodies not coming to the hospital and being evaluated and examined. I think this is where, you know, we have to be, you know, we have to look at this as not a black and white picture, and that it's the decision about virtual visits and you know, mobilizing a visiting nurse to treat a patient at home is going to be dependent on what is the study, what is the agent, what are the side effects, right? I'm going to be totally comfortable, for example, if there is a prevention trial, right, that is using a natural product that has been given and, you know, is over the, off the shelf product that is looking at reducing risk of, say, breast cancer, and where the patients take them at their convenience at home. And well, you can have a virtual visit and go over the diary and you know, pill count and ask the patient questions that they probably don't even need to come except for a mammogram once a year if that's the situation. But if you're using a compound that has quite a bit of toxicities, there are medical legal issues here. There is a safety issue. There is, you know, the lack of exam, and that's impossible to conduct fully. We are also moving with some of the, you know, concepts around some studies being provided or study drugs given by visiting nurses. And I think that could be done in very selected protocols, but I do not see those being more than 2% of the therapeutic trials. So I don't think it's going to be the wave of the future. I think that is being considered sometimes in very, very rare diseases where you cannot open a study in, say 1,000 centers so that you can get 50 patients. And there is some talk about doing those in a more, patient-friendly way, or, sometimes we used to fly those patients, and then sometimes the clinical trial pays for that. But you can only do them in the patient's home if the drug is safe. And so it's going to be a case-by-case basis.
Right, of course. So my final question for today, and Dr. Faki, I'll stick with you, kind of a combination question. So tell us about your experience with virtual technology today, and are there any other noteworthy applications for clinical trials that you would like to tell us about or that should be considered?
Yeah, so I'm probably a little bit of an old school doc who likes to see patients. I think we've certainly had to do some virtual visits. I have to say, still, the virtual visits in my practice do not exceed 10% of the visits. And partly is that as a medical oncologist, your patients do get chemo. I treat metastatic disease. 90% of my patients or more are on active chemotherapy. And for them to receive chemotherapy, they have to come in-house. And so it just doesn't make sense for me when they're coming for their every other week chemotherapy, and I have a once a month visit with them, not to see them on a chemo day. So they're not coming for an extra visit. And so we've been, very patient-centric. Even when we stage them, we do the CT scan on the same day, and we see them on the same day. So I give them the results after their scan. So I don't have that need necessarily to cancel visits because they're here on in-house, so I see them. We've had patients from out of town, like San Francisco, for example, who are on an oral, targeted therapy where they had to come every month, and now they've been stable for a while. The sponsor allowed that we only see them every 2 months, so we've had virtual visits with them. We have a platform called Virtual Hope where you can log in and see the patient and talk to them face to face. We're upgrading that so that we can actually even show them their scans. One of the routine things that I do with my patients is every time they have a CT scan for staging is I sit down with them and go over the pictures. Right now, we can't do that in the platform. So there's a lot of things you miss in the virtual visits or having a telephone visit, but I do think that these platforms are moving forward, and I know we're talking here at City of Hope about being able to pull those films and see them virtually. I think one thing you need to keep in mind, however, is that the technology is not easy on everybody, not just providers, but we've got a lot of patients in their late 70s, early 80s, and to just expect them to log in and work their way through technology is not always going to be easy.
Very true. Thank you so much. Dr. McLaughlin, same question to you. How have virtual visits or virtual technology gone for you today? And are there any other noteworthy applications for clinical trials that you would recommend?
Yeah, I echo all of that. I also have a clinical role as the Associate Chief Clinical Officer for Cardiovascular Services at my institution. And so I'm really close to the clinical operations. And, while we switched routine clinical care, outpatient care, almost always entirely to virtual, during March and April, we are switching back, and we expect it to stay about 25% virtual. And at least in the cardiovascular space, it's nowhere near that right now. We're floating around the mid-teens. And I think a lot of reasons for that include some of what was just highlighted, that there's an older patient population who is not comfortable with technology, that people feel that they have a serious disease. Heart problem is a serious problem. They want to come in and, be examined by their provider. And so many of these patients are getting other tests, echoes, stress tests, DVUs, what have you. So it's not maintained as much as we thought it would. We certainly have a very lovely platform. We can show images. We can even have multiple people in the room. So if we're seeing someone and they've got a son or a daughter in different places, we can have them all in the room. So very nice for patients. But I don't think it is going to have the penetration that we had hoped. And I think certainly in the clinical trial population, we will face some of those same challenges. I think the only thing that might help overcome that for some trials is just the frequency of the visits. And if they don't necessarily need to be in person, if they don't necessarily involve a study-related procedure, I think people might try a little bit harder in the current environment to be able to do this virtually.
Thank you so much. That's great. That concludes all of the topics that we had for today, but we do have a number of questions, I believe, and some time, a few more minutes to address them. So Ashley, I think I'll turn it back to you for the first question.
Great. Thank you, Lonnie. So the first question that we have is, how has COVID impacted sites participating in real-world studies? And will sites deprioritize such studies? Dr. McLaughlin, do we want to start with you, please?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, I think the real-world studies registries and the like are really easy to enroll. I mean, most of the time, since it's real world, it's just the routine care that patients are getting. They don't have to make extra visits. I think it's really great for the study teams because they don't think, their enrollment is not going to be as challenging as a patient who may need to come into a lot of visits. And, so as you were asking about budget questions earlier, that may help float study teams for a while. So I don't foresee that as a challenge. And I foresee study teams being very enthusiastic about continuing those types of studies.
Okay. And Dr. Fakih?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that, most of those studies are going through. I think when COVID really hit hard, we took a strong look at, who are the clinical research coordinators that need to be here, which studies are a must and which are not. And I can tell you initially, for example, we put a hold on endorsing biospecimen collection trials that require face-to-face, consenting with patients. And so there was some prioritization that really put the therapeutic trials on top just to kind of limit the operational resources to therapeutic trials rather than non-therapeutic trials. Those studies that were up and running, we continued them, but certainly some studies took a hit and were deprioritized in the also endorsement as well as the activation process. I think if COVID does hit again and one may reprioritize in a similar fashion in the future, nothing is off the table. But at this point, I would have to say things are completely back to normal. I mean, we had just started a large effort on doing across the board genomic profiling for whole tumors in our institute on a research basis, including germline testing for patients. So everybody's being consented for that. So I don't think that much anymore. Yeah.
Great. We got another question in about patient wearable devices. So tell us about your experience with clinical trials with patient wearables, and have you seen any limitations with wearables and similar types of technology?
Yeah, I mean, we have some experience.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Dr.
Well, I was
McLaughlin.
going to say I don't have too much experience with that. I think surgeons in our institutes have been doing that, and for medical oncology, I don't have any studies that require devices, but I do know that looking at quality of life and post-operative recovery, many of our surgical colleagues are still doing those studies.
And Dr. McLaughlin?
Yeah, we've had some experience using actigraphy and step count and that sort of thing. Some studies that we've done correlating quality of life with their everyday activity. So I think that's really great. I think that there are two issues with respect to clinical trials. One is that you still have technologic challenges. I think when we do these studies, our coordinators end up spending a fair amount of time on the phone with people, trying to make sure that they're wearing their devices properly, that they're syncing them, that they're not just sitting there on the dresser, that sort of thing. So I think that is one issue. But the second issue is that, at least in my area, there's no validated endpoint using these devices, right? So I think it's an exploratory endpoint in a lot of clinical trials. We have a lot of excitement about it, but as of now, it's not really been correlated with anything that the FDA considers feels, functions, survives that could be an approvable endpoint. So I think that's where the challenge is. I think we're going to get there, but I don't think that we're quite there yet.
Okay, great. And I know we're coming up on time, so let's just wrap with one final question. This one is a little bit different. I think it's more targeted toward perhaps fellow SCIPDA members and other HCPs in the audience. Do you have any advice for physicians who haven't yet served as clinical trial investigators but are exploring the idea?
And Ashley, if I could just add to that question, since it's our last one, in addition to that question Ashley asked, if you could also, we have a number of clinical trial sponsors listening in today as well. So in addition to the physicians interested in learning about becoming an investigator, to our clinical trial sponsors on the phone, if you could give them any piece of advice to help navigate this time, what would it be? So Dr. McLaughlin, why don't we start with you first on both of those questions? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess I'm coming at it from a viewpoint at an academic medical center. And for me, it's mentorship, right? Like, I'm so fortunate to be working with fellows and junior faculty and have hired, 3 people into my program over the years that I've personally trained and mentored. And I feel like they know how to do clinical trials at this point. So I think it's establishing a mentor-mentee relationship so that you really learn how to do that. Of course, there are all the training materials and this and that probably the sponsors have you go through and that institutions require. But one of the most important points for me is having a strong mentor to help guide you through those initial times.
Great, thank you. Dr. Fakih, could you answer those last 2 questions as well before we end?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. We have a network, community network that is part of our City of Hope Institute, and that's exactly what we're doing. We're identifying a champion in each of those larger facilities, and then we basically have monthly meetings with them that are virtual, and we assign them a mentor or a buddy to answer all these questions. But also, I would say that if you're starting into clinical trials, don't start with phase 1s. I mean, you really need, there's some learning curve that you need to understand and know that you need to dedicate time. You need to have the protocol on hand every time you see the patient and look at what to do for different lab values. And you have to be very stringent and follow, sometimes we think of with our emotions, and that's not how clinical trials work. You cannot just, I want to get them on this study. So know that it does require, a lot of time and effort, and you really need not only to be committed yourself, but you really have to have the right staff in your office that is dedicated to help you with this. So it's not something that just happens, easily, but I would encourage them to start with maybe phase 2s and phase 3s and identify some support and some assistance from other providers experienced with this.
Excellent. Well, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much. I'd like to thank all of our speakers, Dr. Search, Lonnie Rannon, Dr. Valerie McLaughlin, Dr. Marwan Fakih, for that wonderful, engaging discussion. Just as a reminder, a recording for today's session will be emailed to all of the registrants and will be available to view on demand. On behalf of Informa Pharma Intelligence, thank you very much for joining us and have a great rest of the day.
Great. Thank you.